Welcome to another segment of GBAR Conversations. I'm 2023 GBAR President Allison Sosha. In this episode, we'll be discussing the newly passed remote online notarization law approved in Massachusetts with attorney Noelle DiCarlo. Noelle is a partner in the law firm of Warshaw, DiCarlo & Associates in Boston and Lexington, and also serves as director with the Massachusetts Real Estate Bar Association. Welcome, Noelle.
Thank you, Allison.
Let's get started with an overview. Exactly what is remote online notarization? What's the impact in the real estate sector? And also, what's the timeline?
So in March of this year, Governor Healy signed into law Chapter 2 of the Acts of 2023, and that allowed remote online notarization, also known as RON. And RON allows for and permits the signing of documents and notarization of those documents using electronic video communication. And the law goes into effect in January of 2024. And between now and January of 2024, there will be regulations promulgated by the Secretary of State. Those regulations will regulate the conduct of communication technology utilizing RON. They will discuss what identity proofing is needed, what tamper seal technology is needed, as well as registering communication technologies that utilize RON. But this was really an initiative that started back in 2018 when the Real Estate Bar Association, known as REBA, partnered alongside the title insurance company CADIC and formed a strategic alliance to bring RON into Massachusetts while preserving and protecting our values. And I think we accomplished that with this legislation. But practically, what does that mean for you and your members? What does that mean? The days of attending your attorney's office, attending a closing at your attorney's office, like my office, are long gone. You can sign your closing documents at the final walkthrough. You can sign your closing documents on a beach in Florida, at work, on your couch. And it also will allow for you to sign other documents needed for a closing utilizing RON, such as a deed from a seller to a buyer or a 6D certificate. How great is that?
I think it's fantastic because it's going to help streamline the process, catch us up with other parts of the country. And we saw this kind of come together during the pandemic when we were not able to be in offices the same way that we've traditionally been. So as a matter of fact, I've not been invited back to a closing since the pandemic. So I think it's something that it feels as though we've got a little bit of a test run and probably come at it with such a great background, having had that. And then just making sure that everything stays so secure. Massachusetts is so interested in taking care of our consumers. So it's reassuring to hear all of that in regards to this.
That's right.
Now, is remote online notarization the same as remote ink signed notarization?
That's a good question. So as you mentioned, the pandemic really brought this issue to the forefront. And during the pandemic, the same partnership of REBA and CADIC alongside our legislative council and other members of REBA, we formed we called Gang of Nine. And the Gang of Nine really came together and helped draft the RON legislation. But back in the pandemic, when that was just a thought or an idea, we had really nothing at our fingertips to confront the fact that people did not want to meet in person to sign documents. So we helped draft and pass the what's called RIN, Remote Ink Signed Notarization. And RIN is not RON. RIN was a situation, and it was a bit bulky, but it was a Band-Aid serving the need that we had at the time. So with RIN, you would have multiple video conferences, usually on a platform such as Zoom. The notary would watch the principal sign the documents. Then the principal would deliver the documents either by mail or they would drop things off in the lobby of an attorney's office. I would then go back on a Zoom with them to make sure that the documents that were dropped off were in fact the documents I saw that were signed. Then I would stamp them, then I would record them. And so that wasn't really practical for the amount of closings that were happening, although it served a need, but it has long since sunsetted, and now we have more permanent RON legislation that meets the changing times.
Well, at the end of the day, we need to meet our clients where they are and
That's
make
right.
sure that we're streamlining any process. So it's exciting to me to hear that the kind of conveyancing world is trying to do everything that they can to make it be easier on the home purchasers and refinance
Absolutely.
kind of situations, et cetera, like that. And yes, multiple driving and videoing doesn't quite seem like the best plan. So it's exciting in that way too.
Yeah, it worked for a little bit, but not for a long time.
So what are some of the concerns here in the Commonwealth about enacting remote online notarization?
So there was a series of concern that the Real Estate Bar Association had with the RON legislation, and RON was really sweeping the nation. I think when we started looking into RON, it was already enacted in 30 plus states. It's now been enacted in over 40 states. So the majority of states have their version of RON legislation. But the concerns really are the consumer's protection, as well as in Massachusetts, the attorney's role in the closing. So, I mean, I don't know how many times you've signed your Apple privacy policy and read it. I know that I can say I've signed it multiple times on every update, but I've never read it. And we didn't want the same thing to happen with a mortgage or a closing. I mean, these are substantial legal rights that are being transferred, which is why it's important to have an attorney involved, and also important that the consumers are protected. So those were our major concerns. And I think we accomplished that in this legislation.
It's really exciting. So who's able to notarize documents using remote online notarization?
Not every notary, just because they are a notary public in the Commonwealth, are allowed to utilize RON. As I mentioned, the Secretary of State is going to be promulgating regulations, and part of those regulations are going to have a registry of communication technology that is able to serve as a platform for RON, and likely training for notary publics. It's most importantly, when it comes to closings of 1 to 4 family residential homes, the notary public must be an attorney, or they must be someone who is directly supervised by an attorney. And why is that important? Because we need to make sure that the clients understand what they're signing, and that the closings are considered the practice of law, and that an attorney must remain involved.
Sure, since we don't want anybody practicing law without a license. And also, it's not just a legal document, right? This is something a little bit bigger than
Yes.
just that simple kind of signing. There's a level of understanding and also with banking standards and things of that nature that really affect how things might come together.
And usually when people are at my desk signing closing documents, you figure they will have fully understood the transaction at that time. But the amount of questions I get is, I didn't realize that my loan will adjust, or this doesn't really meet my expectation. And that is really the last stop before a substantial legal right is transferred. So it's very important to have an attorney involved.
There's a lot of fine print.
Yes, there
in a
is.
mortgage,
There is
that's
a lot
for
of pages.
So you had initially mentioned that there are going to be some platforms. Do you have any inkling for what type of platforms might be able to be used for RON?
Yes, so I can't stress enough how important it's going to be to select a platform that conforms with the law. Massachusetts is really different from other states, as I'm sure you know, in how we practice the conveyance of real estate. Other states use title companies to transfer ownership and to conduct closings. But in Massachusetts, we are an attorney state, meaning that an attorney must be substantially involved in a closing. So if you look nationally at all of the RON legislation in other states, they didn't take into account that attorneys are involved. So we knew that we would be drafting novel legislation, and that this novel legislation would serve as a template to other attorney closing states. As part of that, we actually formed a strategic alliance with Notarize.com. Notarize is actually a Boston-based company. The head of Notarize is from Massachusetts, but they are really a national leader in remote online notarization, and they have helped pass and draft legislation in over 30 states. So we worked with them to say, what does legislation look like in other states, and how will that fit in with our values here in Massachusetts? And further, I can draft any legislation I want, or any regulation I want, but if you can't build it into a platform, what's the use, right? So we also worked with them to say, how can we actually practically make this work within technology and that's way beyond my pay grade, but we relied on their input. So, it's important to choose the correct platform. You certainly don't want to choose a platform and then find out later that that deed is invalid or that mortgage was invalid. So personally, at my law firm, we'll be using Notarize.com, and we feel that they will be, strict compliance with the law.
Well, it's just so important to make sure that taking this consumer-focused element with the attorneys involved in our conveyancing and then understanding what's happening out in the marketplace and getting all those stakeholders in the room. And that it's exciting that it's even a local company who's going to benefit from it and also provide a service to the citizens of the Commonwealth, in addition to making certain that we have all of the stopgaps in place so that our folks know that the house that they purchased is really the house that they purchased.
Right. And the Secretary of State will have a registration system for these technologies. You certainly want to choose from that list, but then, beyond that, you want to continue to vet them to make sure they really are in compliance with Massachusetts' unique set of guidelines.
Well, you know us, we like to be a little different.
Yes.
So will documents that are electronically executed using remote online notarization be accepted for recording and registration as long as they would just need to meet those guidelines, correct?
That's correct. So yeah, the whole point of this is that when you sign the documents using the online platform, that then the registry will take them and record the documents. So because it is utilizing this new technology, there is a little bit extra steps to recording the documentation. The documentation would have to contain a certificate from the notary, and that certificate must state that it is in fact the same documentation that was signed electronically. It hasn't been tampered with. It has to also include that it was signed using RON, and most importantly, it needs to include in the closing of a 1 to 4 family residential home the BBO number, which is sort of akin to a license number of the attorney or the supervising attorney. And why is that so important? Well, for someone who reviews titles frequently, and you find title problems all the time, the first thing I do is I look at who notarized the document. If it's an attorney or someone that I can Google and see works for an attorney, that's the law firm I'm calling to say, hey, do you have a proof of payoff of that loan? Or did you happen to order X, Y, and Z? And that's essential. If you have a large closing, national title company coming in doing hundreds of closings, good luck calling them and asking for their help. So having our license numbers right there for everyone to see will be a huge help in fixing title problems. As you know, in Massachusetts, we have the land court and we have the recorded land. Well, the act allows for the Chief Justice of the land court to promulgate his or her own regulations, and they are working on those actively, and we'll have a set of regulations that are out before the January date, and we'll see what they have, but there will be extra steps for the land court, likely.
Okay. So love all the security measures. It's exciting to me just because we want to make sure our clients are taken care of and then have the other steps in place to monitor things as it all kind of moves along. So I can remember back during the pandemic when RIN was happening, there was a lot of discussion just as people were wherever it was that they were kind of quarantining or living, about making certain that you were here in the Commonwealth. Is there some sort of a rule that has to do with the notary and the person who's doing the close, the kind of buyer, if you will, where they're located?
Yeah, that's a good question. So under RIN, both the notary and the principal had to be located in Massachusetts. With RON, the notary still needs to be located in Massachusetts. However, you could be sipping tea in London, you can be having a nice Chianti in the hills of Tuscany and signing your closing documents. The principal or the person signing the documents truly does not need to be in the Commonwealth. They can be anywhere in the jurisdiction of the United States or in any country that allows remote online notarization. So just a couple of my favorite travel spots: Italy, Spain, Germany, England. Those are just a handful of places that allow for this. And it really makes a big deal for our servicemen and servicewomen who really during the pandemic weren't able to utilize refinances to lower their rate because they just weren't in a place that they could get a notary. So this will really help that community as well.
So that's exciting. And So if somebody was going to travel, you
Yes.
should just speak with your attorney.
Correct.
Make certain that it is a location that can be is kind of identified and
Yes.
and okay, which is so interesting to me because when I've had folks who are working in another location, they would always have to make appointments at the consulate and the
Yes.
embassy
Oh,
and things of
apostilles,
that
yeah.
things of that nature. So this is so exciting that way too.
And I have to say, it's very difficult nowadays to get appointments at the embassy.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have situations where people can't sell or buy just because they're abroad and they can't get an appointment soon enough at the embassy. So this will really help streamline the process and allow property transfers to move more seamlessly.
So Noelle, can all documents that require a signature be done under the RON laws?
That's another great question, Allison. So the RON legislation specifically excludes two types of documents. So any electoral documents or any wills and codicils or anything purporting to be a will or codicil are not able to utilize RON for now. That may change, but at the moment, you can't sign those and have them notarized electronically.
And then I also understand that there is some proposed federal legislation to permit remote online notarization. Are there any similarities, differences, things of that nature that you might be able to share with us in regards to how that might differ here in the Commonwealth?
Sure. So there was some proposed federal legislation that did in fact pass the House in 2023 and never made it past the Senate. The federal legislation is called the Secure Notarization Act. You know, I think that the time for it to have passed was during the COVID pandemic because that's when it was most needed. Given that we were able to muddle through without federal legislation, I don't think it's high on their priority. And given that the lion's share of states have their own RON legislation, again, it's not high on the list of priorities for the federal government. But it very much may pass. I mean, there is a great difference between RON legislation state to state. Some states, you know, they feel like they're cowboys and you can sign anything anywhere and it's considered fine, and some states are very stringent. So the federal legislation may be helpful to codify, you know, some minimum standard between the states. And who's to say what eventually would come out of the Senate, since it didn't make it that far last time. But I do think that there will be three key elements that federal legislation will contain, and we hope is there. The first is some minimum standards for consumer protection, for obvious reasons. And the second is for interstate recognition. Right now, if a state that does allow for RON comes to Massachusetts, our RON legislation is not enacted, so that document would not be accepted at the Registry of Deeds for recording. A federal bill may allow for interstate recognition, which is great once we're active with our laws if you have to be recorded in another state that does not have RON. And then lastly, and most importantly, I think, it will provide that if a state has its own legislation, its own laws that meet the minimum standards in the federal bill, then the state law will supersede. And that's what we hope, because we really spent so much time and care in the law that was passed here in Massachusetts that we hope it remains preserved regardless of whether federal legislation passes.
Well, that's really interesting to hear, and I love that we're already batting 1,000 here in the Commonwealth. Thanks to all thanks to all the good work. Now, for realtors, would your best advice be to just apprise our clients to make sure that they're in contact with their attorney and kind of leave it in the hands of the attorney, or are there other things that we should maybe be considering to help our clients understand what's happening?
Well, I do think that realtors should become notary publics, and they should train to use RON in their daily activities. You know, getting 6D certificates signed, how much easier that will be if you can take care of that for your client. Mm-hmm. Getting deeds signed, same thing. Deeds, of course, prepared by their attorney. But there are always documents that are needed, and you already are used to using DocuSign or .loop or some electronic platform. So it would just be another service that you can offer your clients. But again, make sure you're signed up to a very good, secure platform that complies with our regulations. When it comes to the actual closings, it's likely that both the banks and the title companies are going to regulate whether RON can be used, and it will probably be a slow start with the large national lenders who are currently already using RON in other states being the first to enter the game here, and then the small local banks likely being the last. But I imagine within the next several years, really very few closings are going to happen in an attorney's office, and most will be utilizing Ron. But again, title companies will likely give their list of vendors that they feel comply with the law, and banks as well, and the attorney should be up and running and up to speed on it. We all know that there are some attorneys out there that don't love changes with technology, but this is where we're going, and so you want to make sure you're partnered with an attorney that will be up and running with Ron.
Thank you, Noelle, for helping us educate our members today. It was such a worthwhile conversation.
Thank you for having me, Allison. Happy to.
Our pleasure. And thank you to all of our members for joining us for another GBAR Conversations. We'll see you at the next one.